If you put a Japanese person and a Korean person side by side, most people around the world would guess they are two different things. The clothes, the body language, the rhythm of the words they speak, everything about the surface says separate. Ask someone from Seoul what they share with someone from Osaka, and you might get a polite smile and a long pause. Ask someone from Tokyo the same question about Busan, and you might get something closer to a wince. These are two nations with a complicated history. Centuries of rivalry, a brutal colonial occupation still raw in living memory, territorial disputes that flare up every few years, textbook controversies, trade wars, diplomatic freezes that can last for decades. They cannot even agree on what to call the body of water between them. Japan says Sea of Japan. Korea says East Sea. That argument alone has been going for over a century. The political space between these two countries sometimes feels as wide as an ocean. The cultural space feels even wider. Japanese cuisine prizes restraint, negative space, the beauty of what is left out. Korean food fills every surface of the table at once. Japanese music leans into silence. Korean pop fills stadiums with synchronized light. Even the way the two cultures handle emotion is different. The Japanese instinct to contain, the Korean instinct to release. Everything about the surface says these are different peoples. And if all you had was the surface, you would never guess what the blood says. Because when researchers finally mapped the genomes of both populations at scale, they found an overlap so large it made the political distance almost absurd. Japanese and Korean people share roughly 90% of their genetic components, not in the vague way that all humans are related. In the specific, measurable, traceable way that geneticists use to determine whether two groups are, for all practical purposes, the same population. 90%. That is the kind of number you normally find between groups who share a flag, who share a national anthem, who would never think of themselves as fundamentally different. So how did two populations that close become two nations that different? How did one family become two strangers who cannot even agree on the name of the sea between them? That question is what this video is about. And the answer does not start with war, or language, or politics, or any of the things these two nations argue about today. It starts with water. 50 kilometers of it. The Korea Strait runs between the southern coast of the Korean Peninsula and the northwestern coast of Kyushu, the closest of Japan's main islands. It is about 200 kilometers wide, which on a map looks like nothing, a gap you could cover with your thumb. But right in the middle of that strait sits an island called Tsushima, long and narrow, draped in dense forest, home to fewer than 30,000 people. If you stand on the waterfront in Busan and look south on a clear morning, you can see Tsushima from the shore. 50 kilometers of water. That is all. On a calm day, in a good boat, you could cross it between breakfast and lunch. And for most of human history, that sliver of sea between them was not a border. It was a highway. Rice, bronze, iron, pottery, burial customs, religious ideas, and above all, people crossed that water continuously for thousands of years. This was never a border. It was a corridor, and what moved through it shaped both nations more than either likes to admit. But to understand what that crossing created, you first need to know who was already there. And their story reaches so deep into time that it feels more like geology than history. About 20,000 years ago, the sea was lower. Japan was not an archipelago. Land bridges connected it to the Asian mainland, and living on that connected land was a group of people who had already been there so long that, by any reckoning, the place was theirs. We call them the Jomon, after the rope pattern marks they pressed into their pottery. That pottery is part of what makes them so remarkable. At a site called Odai Yamamoto in northern Japan, pottery fragments have been dated to roughly 16,500 years ago. That is among the oldest fired clay found anywhere on Earth. While most of humanity was still following herds from camp to camp, the Jomon had stopped moving. They built permanent settlements near rivers and coastlines. They fished with bone hooks in waters rich with tuna and sea bream. They hunted deer and boar in the forested mountains that ran like a spine through every island. They gathered chestnuts and acorns and wild grapes from forests so dense that even today parts of Japan feel primordial. And the things they made with their hands. Clay figures, small enough to hold in your palm, with enormous hollow eyes and swollen bodies that seem to vibrate with some meaning we have lost the ability to read. Flame-rimmed pots with edges that rise like frozen fire, so elaborately sculpted they look more like art than cookware. Jade ornaments polished to a gleam. Lacquered wood that still carries its sheen after thousands of years buried in soil. These were not primitive people waiting to be replaced. These were a complex, creative, deeply adapted civilization that had shaped itself entirely around the islands they lived on. And then the world closed around them. Over several thousand years, the glaciers melted and the sea rose. The land bridges flooded. Japan became islands. And the Jomon were sealed off from the rest of the world. Their effective population, the number of people actually contributing genes to the next generation, stabilized at roughly 1,000. 4 millennia. A tiny community, inward-facing, evolving in near total isolation, while everything on the continent was transforming around them. I think about that number sometimes. 1,000 people, for thousands of years. The same faces at the hearth, the same bloodlines in the fishing boats, the same hands shaping the same style of pot across 100 generations. There is something in that continuity that feels almost sacred. A thread held taut across deep time. When modern geneticists finally extracted DNA from Jomon remains, they found exactly what that kind of isolation produces. The Jomon lineage had diverged from other East Asian populations between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. The gap was enormous. They were not closely related to Chinese, not to Koreans, not to any continental group. They were a deep, ancient, singular branch of the human family tree, shaped by time and sea into something no one else on Earth was, and they had no idea what was coming across the water. About 3,000 years ago, people started arriving on the northern coast of Kyushu. Not a handful, not a trading party. A sustained, rolling migration that would continue for over 1,000 years. They came from the southern Korean Peninsula, crossing the strait in boats, island hopping from the coast to Tsushima, from Tsushima to the small island of Iki, from Iki to the shores of Kyushu. The strait was notorious even then. Rough water, unpredictable currents, the kind of crossing where you loaded your boat knowing you might not make it. But they loaded their boats anyway, and those boats were heavy with purpose. They carried wet rice and the knowledge of how to grow it in standing water. They carried polished stone tools and wooden farming implements. They carried iron and bronze. They carried weaving technology, ceramic storage jars, domesticated pigs, and a way of building settlements surrounded by defensive ditches that the Jomon had never seen. They brought, in short, a complete civilization packed into wooden boats, and they unpacked it on the shores of Japan. Here is the detail I cannot stop thinking about. Those migrants carried a specific style of house from a Korean culture called songgukri. These houses are architecturally distinctive, immediately recognizable to any archaeologist familiar with the Korean Bronze Age. And when researchers counted how many of the earliest farming settlements in Western Japan contained these Korean-style houses, the number was staggering. 326 out of 710. Nearly half of all Yayoi settlements in Western Japan were built by people who had just crossed the strait, or by their children who had grown up hearing about the crossing. That is not cultural diffusion. That is not a slow spread of ideas. That is thousands of people, arriving with everything, building new villages among and alongside a population that had been alone on those islands for 16,000 years. We call the arrivals the Yayoi. And what happened next was not a war. It was something quieter and in some ways more extraordinary than any conquest could have been. The Jomon and the Yayoi intermarried. They merged. Not all at once, not everywhere at the same pace, but steadily, village by village, generation by generation. On the island of Kyushu, some Jomon communities held on longer than others. Genome studies of Yayoi-era burials in Nagasaki found individuals with full Jomon ancestry, living right alongside mixed communities. They were not pushed out. They were there, next door, choosing when and whether to merge, for centuries. Over time, the line between newcomer and native blurred, softened, and eventually dissolved into something new. The Jomon were not destroyed. They were woven in. Their blood, their genes, their ancient coastal adaptation, their 16,000-year relationship with the islands, folded into a new population that was neither fully Jomon nor fully Korean, but something that had never existed before. That new population is the one you see today when you look at a map of Japan and picture its people. Modern mainland Japanese carry somewhere between 10 and 20% Jomon ancestry. The rest, the clear majority, descends from those Yayoi migrants who came from the Korean Peninsula. And when researchers compare the full genetic profile of Japanese populations to every other group in East Asia, looking for the closest living relative, the answer is not ambiguous. It is not Chinese, it is not Mongolian, it is Korean. 87 to 94% shared genetic material. Let that land. Two nations that have spent a century arguing about history, territory, and identity share nearly all of their DNA. But the strangeness does not stop there. It deepens. If you want to find the people in Japan who are most genetically similar to the ancient Jomon, you do not look at the heartland. Not Tokyo, not Osaka, not Kyoto, the seat of imperial culture for over 1,000 years. You look at the margins. The Ainu people of Hokkaido in the far north, the Ryukyuans of Okinawa in the far south. These populations, pushed to the edges of the archipelago across centuries of expansion and consolidation, carry the highest proportion of Jomon DNA. They are the closest living link to the people who were there first, which leads to something quietly devastating. The populations at the cultural and political center of Japan, the ones who built the temples and the writing system and the imperial line, and the identity that the world recognizes as Japanese, are the ones most descended from people who arrived from somewhere else. The most Japanese, in cultural terms, are the least original, in genetic terms. The most original are the least recognized. If you find stories like this worth sitting with, this is the channel where they live. Consider subscribing. There is much more ground ahead. In 2024, a research team at the University of Tokyo led by Juno Hashi published a study that drew the sharpest line yet between what these two nations share and what separates them. They sequenced the complete genome of an individual buried at the Doigahama site, a Yayoi-period cemetery in Yamaguchi Prefecture. This person had died roughly 2,300 years ago, during the first great wave of migration. When the team compared that 2,000-year-old genome to every modern population in East Asia, the closest match, aside from modern Japanese, was clear. Korean. Not ambiguously. Not one possibility among several. Ohashi put it plainly. The majority of immigrants to the Japanese archipelago during the Yayoi and Kofun periods originated primarily from the Korean Peninsula. That alone would have been significant. But the same body of research turned up something even more disorienting, working in the opposite direction entirely. At a site called Ryukyuan on the southern Korean peninsula, archaeologists had previously excavated ancient human remains. When geneticists analyzed that individual's DNA, they found something that nobody had expected and nobody quite knew what to do with. This person, buried in Korean soil, carried nearly 100% Jomon ancestry. The genetic signature of Japan's most ancient inhabitants, the people of rope-patterned pottery and jade ornaments and 16,000 years of island isolation, locked inside a grave on the Korean coast. I keep coming back to that image. A body in Korean ground with Japanese blood. A body in Japanese ground with Korean blood. 3,000 years ago, these categories meant nothing. The people living on either side of the strait would not have recognized the distinction we build our entire understanding of the region around. Japanese, Korean. Those were not identities yet. They were not even ideas yet. The strait was not a border between two worlds. It was a neighborhood, a shared coastline. People lived on both sides, crossed between both sides, married on both sides, raised children who belonged to both sides, and were buried on both sides. The line between Japanese and Korean did not exist yet, because the people themselves had not yet decided to draw it. There is something in that fact that makes me want to slow down and just stay with it. The boundary we treat as ancient, as bedrock, as given, is actually a very recent invention. The people we call Japanese and the people we call Korean spent far more of their shared history as one community than they have spent as two. And even after the major migrations slowed, the mixing continued. During Korea's Three Kingdoms period, roughly 2,000 years ago, some individuals from the Gaya Confederacy in southern Korea still carried about 37% Jomon ancestry. That is not a trace. That is not a statistical ghost. That is more than a third of a genome belonging to a lineage most associated with the opposite side of the strait. Centuries after the Great Wave, centuries after the boats had stopped arriving in numbers, the door was still open. People were still crossing, still marrying across the water, still refusing to recognize a border that would not be invented for another millennium. So what closed it? What turned a bridge into a wall? The languages feel like they should hold the answer. Japanese and Korean share nearly identical sentence structures. Subject, object, verb. Similar particles, similar grammatical logic. When a Japanese speaker studies Korean grammar, or vice versa, the architecture is hauntingly familiar, like walking into a stranger's house and finding the furniture arranged exactly like your own. And yet, no linguist has been able to definitively prove that the two languages share a common ancestor. The vocabularies sound different. The writing systems are entirely different. One study proposed around 500 core words that might trace back to a shared root. But the field remains divided, contested, unresolved. Two languages that behave like relatives but cannot produce the family photograph. It is almost as if the biology kept the connection alive while the culture worked, slowly and deliberately, to overwrite it. And then, for one brief moment, the overwriting cracked. In December of 2001, with the World Cup that Japan and South Korea were about to co-host just months away, Emperor Akihito held a press conference. He was asked about Japanese-Korean relations, and instead of the diplomatic nothing that everyone expected, he said something that sent shockwaves through both countries. He said he felt a certain kinship with Korea. He cited an 8th century Japanese chronicle recording that the mother of Emperor Kanmu, one of Japan's greatest rulers, was a descendant of King Muryong of Baekje, an ancient Korean kingdom. It was the first time a sitting Japanese emperor had publicly acknowledged Korean blood in the imperial line. Korean newspapers ran it on their front pages as a historic breakthrough, a royal admission of shared ancestry. Political parties in Seoul hailed it as a landmark moment. Japanese media handled it with near total silence, as if the emperor had said something slightly embarrassing at dinner that everyone agreed to pretend they had not heard. Scholars in both countries already knew the lineage. It had been in the historical record for over 1,000 years, plain as day, available to anyone who cared to look. But there is a vast distance between knowing a fact and saying it out loud, with the weight of the chrysanthemum thrown behind it, in the hearing of both nations. That distance, the space between what the blood says and what the identity allows, is the entire story. The truth is, The question this video started with cannot be answered with a simple yes or no. Are Japanese and Koreans the same people? Genetically, they are closer than almost any two populations on Earth that consider themselves distinct. Culturally, they have diverged across 3,000 years of separate history into something genuinely, beautifully, irreducibly different. The food, the music, the art, the humor, the architecture of silence and ceremony, the ways joy is shared and grief is carried. All of it different, all of it real, none of it imagined. But underneath all of it, the bones keep saying the same thing. What nobody can explain, what the DNA cannot answer, and the archaeology can only gesture toward, is why the forgetting happened so completely. Why two peoples separated by 50 kilometers of water built such a thorough wall of identity between themselves that even an emperor admitting the connection out loud became front-page news. Why the bridge became a border. Maybe identity requires a boundary. Maybe the narrower the strait, the higher the wall needs to be, because the resemblance underneath is too close for comfort. Think about where the world's bitterest rivalries live. Not between peoples who are truly different. Between neighbors, between siblings, between the ones who see too much of themselves in each other and cannot bear the mirror. Or maybe 3,000 years is simply enough time. Enough for one people to become two. Enough for the bridge to start feeling like a wall. Enough for the water to do what water always does, slowly, quietly, without anyone noticing, separate things that were once joined until no one alive remembers they were ever connected. But the DNA remembers. That is the thing about genes. They do not care about flags or borders or the stories nations tell about themselves. They just keep the record. And the record says, in language that does not argue or negotiate or hurt, that these two peoples were once one people, that the water between them was crossed so many times, in so many directions, by so many unnamed humans carrying rice and bronze and hope and fear, that the idea of a clean separation is a fiction maintained by everyone standing on both shores. Stand in Busan on a clear morning. Look south across the Korea Strait. You can see the dark outline of Tsushima against the horizon, and beyond it, just barely, the suggestion of Kyushu. 50 kilometers of cold, dark water. Close enough to imagine someone, 3,000 years ago, loading a small boat with rice seedlings and bronze tools and everything they owned, pushing off from shore, and rowing toward a place that was not yet home. They did not know they were founding a country. They did not know the people waiting on the other side would absorb them and be changed by them and become something neither could have imagined. They did not know that one day the descendants on both shores would look at each other across the same narrow water and see strangers. They just saw land.